Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into the drafty, stone halls of the House of Stuart, a dynasty whose story proves that being born into royalty is less a fairy tale and more a constant, brutal power struggle. We're going to walk in the shadow of one of history's most dramatic figures, a woman whose name, even centuries later, still whispers of tragedy and controversy. Mary, Queen of Scots. Your life as a Stuart monarch doesn't begin with a gilded crown, it begins with the crushing weight of her legacy. A legacy of religious strife, political intrigue, and a violent, unshakable claim to a throne that was never truly secure. You will see that the drama of your own family, for all its complexities, is nothing compared to a world where your mother's ghost is a political weapon. Honestly, you probably wouldn't have survived the christening, let alone the throne. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always cool to think we're all listening to the same story from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are born into a world of contradictions and danger. Your name is James, and you are the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her cousin, Lord Darnley. From the moment you draw your first breath, your life is a political football. Your mother is Catholic, your country is fiercely Protestant, and your father is a weak, paranoid man who is eventually murdered in a mysterious explosion. You are less than a year old when you are crowned king, a small baby with a crown placed on your head, a puppet in a power play orchestrated by the Scottish nobility. Your mother, Mary, the most beautiful and tragic woman in all of Europe, is a prisoner. She is forced to abdicate the throne in your favor, and you are taken from her, a political prize to be kept safe from her influence. You will never know her. You will never feel her touch. You will never hear her voice. She is a myth, a legend, a shadow in your life, a dangerous, powerful, and utterly unreachable figure. Her name, however, will be a constant presence, a rallying cry for Catholic nobles, a constant threat to your fragile, Protestant throne. You are raised by a series of regents, men who see you not as a child, but as a tool. Your childhood is a gilded cage of isolation and fear. You are constantly being watched, constantly being guarded. You are a king, but you have no power. You are a child with no parents. You are a boy who has no one to love and no one to trust. The only constant in your life is the fear that you will be next, that the same violence that took your father and imprisoned your mother will eventually come for you. Your education is intense and uncompromising. Your tutors, a series of stern, Calvinist scholars, are not just teaching you Latin and Greek, they are teaching you to be a Protestant king, a man who will stand against the papacy and against the ghost of his mother. They are filling your head with a new kind of power, a power that comes not from military might, but from God himself. They are teaching you about the divine right of kings, the idea that your power comes directly from God, and that you are answerable to no one but him. This is a dangerous, intoxicating idea for a young boy who has been a puppet his entire life. It is an idea that will shape your reign and, ultimately, destroy your dynasty. A little-known and rather ironic fact is that, while you were being raised in a fiercely Protestant court, your mother was a prisoner in Catholic England, a constant source of fear for Queen Elizabeth III, Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman you would never meet, was your greatest political asset and your greatest political liability. She was a ghost in your life, a constant reminder of the violence and the chaos that surrounded your birth. Historians still debate the true nature of your childhood. Was it a calculated, brutal form of psychological conditioning? Or was it simply the norm for a monarch of that era? The truth is likely that it was both. Roman society was a brutal one, and power was a zero-sum game. To be a prince was to be a pawn, and Nero was a masterfully played one. But the intensity of his mother's ambition, and the sheer number of murders that surrounded his ascent to power, suggests that his childhood was particularly traumatic. Wait, sorry, wrong story. You are not Nero. You are James. But the sentiment holds. Your childhood was a brutal one, a life of isolation and fear. The psychological toll of this upbringing is immense, leaving you with a deep-seated paranoia and a desperate need for control. A need that will define your reign. You come of age, and you take the throne of Scotland. But you are a man with a divided heart. You love your country, but you are a man with a desperate need for a mother's love. You write letters to your mother. Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman you have never met. You send her gifts. You send her messages of love and loyalty. But you are a man who is also a king. And your duty is to your country. And your duty, as you will soon discover, will eventually force you to choose between your mother and your throne. You've done it. You've successfully navigated the treacherous political waters of Scotland and have finally taken control of your own kingdom. But the victory feels hollow. The ghosts of your parents, the brutal murder of your father, and the imprisonment of your mother are still with you. You are a man with a deep-seated paranoia, a man who sees plots and conspiracies in every shadow. You are a man who has learned from a young age that the world is a dangerous place, and that the only person you can truly trust is yourself. But your newfound power is about to be tested in ways you can't even imagine. In 1603, something truly monumental happens. The childless Queen Elizabeth I of England dies, and as her closest living relative. You, the King of Scotland, are her heir. Suddenly, you are not just the king of a small, poor, and politically unstable country. You are the King of England, a rich, powerful, and culturally vibrant nation. You are now the King of Great Britain. It should be the greatest day of your life, the culmination of all your hopes and dreams. But you are a Stuart, and for a Stuart, a moment of triumph is often followed by a moment of tragedy. You ride south to London, a magnificent procession of Scottish and English nobles, a man who is now the ruler of two nations. But you are not a man who is comfortable in the spotlight. You are a scholar, a theologian, a man who loves to debate the finer points of Calvinist doctrine. You are a man who has been raised in a small, isolated court, and you are now the center of a world of extravagant wealth, courtly intrigue, and a parliament that is far more powerful than anything you have ever encountered. You are a man who believes in the divine right of kings, a man who believes that his power comes directly from God, and you are about to collide with a group of people who believe that their power comes from a document called the Magna Carta. The English Parliament is not a group of fawning courtiers, they are a group of powerful, ambitious, and deeply religious men who believe in their own rights and their own authority. They are not afraid to challenge you, to debate you, to demand that you listen to their concerns. You, the king who believes he is answerable to no one but God, are now faced with a group of men who believe that you are answerable to them. This is a clash of two diametrically opposed worldviews, a clash that will define your reign and ultimately destroy your dynasty. A little known but telling fact is that you, a Scottish king, were also a man with a deep-seated contempt for the Scottish people. You saw them as a wild, uncivilized, and dangerous people. You were a man who was desperate to be seen as an English king, a man who was desperate to be loved and accepted by his new people. But your love for England was not returned. The English saw you as a foreigner, a man with a strange accent and even stranger ideas about the nature of power. You were an outsider, a king who was not truly a part of the country he ruled. Historians still debate the true nature of your personality. Were you a brilliant, if eccentric, scholar who was simply a poor politician? Or were you a paranoid, insecure man who was completely out of his depth in the cutthroat world of English politics? The truth is likely that you were both, You were a man who was brilliant in a theoretical sense, a man who could write a book about the nature of kingship, but you were a man who was completely incapable of putting those ideas into practice. You were a man who was a scholar, but you were also a man who was a king, and the two roles were a constant, brutal source of conflict. Your reign, which began with such high hopes, quickly descends into a series of ugly, humiliating clashes with Parliament. You argue with them about money. You argue with them about religion. You argue with them about the nature of your own power. You are a man who is used to getting his own way, and you are now faced with a group of men who are determined to stop you. You are a man who believes in the divine right of kings, and you are now faced with a group of men who believe in the divine right of Parliament. And in this clash of ideals, you, the king, will eventually lose. The years drag on, and the grand promises of your reign, the ones you made when you were a boy king in Scotland, have long since faded into the grime of London. You are now an old man, a king who is a constant, low-level source of irritation to his parliament and his people. Your belief in the divine right of kings has not wavered, but the world around you is beginning to... The religious tensions that have plagued your family for generations are still there, a simmering pot of anger and resentment that threatens to boil over at any moment. Your son, Charles, is now a young man, a prince who is a constant source of both hope and anxiety for you. You love him, of course, but you also see a part of yourself in him, the stubborn pride, the deep-seated belief in his own authority, the quiet contempt for the men who dare to question him. You are a man who has spent his entire life fighting with Parliament, and you know, deep in your heart, that your son will have to do the same. But where you are a scholar, a man who loves to debate, he is a soldier, a man who loves to fight, and you fear, with a terrible prophetic certainty, that his fight will be far more brutal than your own. You are a king who is in love with his own ideas, a man who is more comfortable in a library than in a council chamber. You write books about the nature of kingship. You debate with theologians. You argue with philosophers. But you are a man who has lost touch with the real world, a world of poverty, of religious strife, and of a parliament that is growing in strength and in confidence. You are a king who is losing his grasp on reality, a man who believes that his words are enough to command an army, to raise a tax, to quell a rebellion. And as you get older, and as your health begins to fail, you realize with a cold, creeping sense of dread that your words are not enough. A little known but telling detail of your later reign is your desperate attempts to marry your son, Charles, into a foreign royal family. You send him to Spain to woo the Infanta, a beautiful and powerful princess. It is a desperate and humiliating failure. The Spanish court, a world of intricate Catholic ritual and diplomatic maneuvering, is a world that your Protestant son is completely out of his depth in. He returns to England, a bitter and humiliated man, and a man who is now convinced that his destiny is to fight, not to negotiate. This is a profound and ultimately fatal lesson that you, the scholarly king, have taught him. Historians still debate the true legacy of your reign. Were you a good king who was simply a victim of a changing world? A man who was caught between the old world of absolute monarchy and the new world of parliamentary democracy? Or were you a bad king, a man who was so blinded by his own vanity and his own ideas that he was completely incapable of leading his people? The truth is likely that you were both. You were a man who was a brilliant intellectual, a man who had a deep and profound understanding of the theory of kingship. But you were also a man who was a terrible politician, a man who was utterly incapable of putting those theories into practice. Your death in 1625 is not a moment of great tragedy or great triumph. It is a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a long, contentious reign. You die in your bed, a king who has spent his entire life fighting for a power that he never truly had. You leave behind a son, Charles, a man who has inherited your stubborn pride, your belief in the divine right of kings, and a deep, unshakable contempt for Parliament. You have not solved the problems of your reign. You have simply passed them on. And you know, in the final moments of your life, that your son's struggle will be far more brutal, far more bloody, and far more tragic than your own. You are Charles, a man who has spent his entire life in the shadow of a father who was a brilliant intellectual, but a terrible king. You have watched as your father's grand ideas about the divine right of kings were constantly and humiliatingly challenged by a parliament that saw him as a foreign eccentric. You have seen the political maneuvering, the religious strife, and the economic chaos that was the legacy of his reign, and you have learned a single. Brutal lesson talk is cheap. Power, true power, is not found in books or in debates. It is found in the willingness to fight for it. You inherit a kingdom that is a tinderbox of religious and political tensions. The Puritans, a powerful and vocal group of religious reformers, are a constant source of friction. They see your love for art, for theater, for the beautiful, intricate ceremonies of the Church of England as a sign of your latent Catholicism. A dangerous and terrifying prospect for a country that is still deeply scarred by the memory of the bloody Tudor past. You, a man who is deeply religious, but who is also a man who believes in the beauty of ceremony and art, are now seen as a threat to the very soul of the nation. Your reign, unlike your father's, is not a series of debates. It is a series of clashes. You believe that you have the right to rule without Parliament, to raise taxes without their consent, to command an army without their approval, and Parliament, for its part, believes that it has the right to control the purse strings, to hold you accountable, to be the voice of the English people. This is not a clash of personalities. It is a clash of two diametrically opposed visions of what England should be. Your biggest blunder, and the one that will set your kingdom on a path to civil war, is your obsession with religion. You and your Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, try to force the Scottish Church to adopt a new prayer book, a book that is seen by the fiercely independent, fiercely Calvinist Scots as a sign of a new Papist tyranny. The Scots, in a moment of defiance that sends a shockwave through your kingdom, sign a national covenant, a solemn oath to defend their religion to the death. You, the king, respond with force. You raise an army and march north. But your army, a half-trained, underfunded force of mercenaries and loyalists, is no match for the determined, battle-hardened Scots. You are humiliated, you are defeated, and you are forced to call a parliament to raise money for the war. A parliament you have not called in 11 years. A parliament that is now more powerful, more angry, and more determined than ever. A little known but telling fact of this period is that your wife, Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess, was seen by the English public as a source of all your problems. They believed she was a papist spy, a woman who was controlling you, and a woman who was trying to bring Catholicism back to England. She was a constant source of ridicule and contempt, a convenient scapegoat for a public that was growing more and more hostile to your reign. Historians still debate the true nature of the English Civil War. Was it a war of religion, a war of political ideals, or a war of class? The truth is that it was all three. It was a war of a king who believed in his divine right to rule, and a parliament that believed in its right to govern. It was a war of a king who believed in the beauty of ceremony and tradition, and a parliament that believed in the austere simplicity of Puritanism. And it was a war of a king who was utterly incapable of understanding the people he was supposed to rule. The Civil War is now inevitable. The Long Parliament. The parliament you call to fund your war against the Scots has now become a de facto revolutionary government. A group of men who are determined to strip you of your power, to hold you accountable, and to remake England in their own image. You, the king who believed in the absolute, unquestionable power of the monarch, are now faced with a brutal and bloody war against your own people. A war that will destroy your family, your kingdom, and your life. The long, bloody, and ultimately tragic war has begun. It is a war of a king against his people, a war of a father against his sons, a war of an old world against a new one. You, the king, are a man who is now a commander, a man who is now a soldier. You have raised an army of loyalists, of nobles and gentry who believe in your divine right. Men who are willing to fight and die for their king. Your parliament, for its part, has raised its own army, a force of radicalized Puritans and ambitious commoners. Men who believe they are fighting for their freedom, their religion, and their God. The country is a divided, brutal, and bloody mess. The war is a constant, grinding misery. There are battles, of course, but there are also long, cold nights in a camp, the constant fear of ambush, the endless search for food and supplies. You are a man who has spent his entire life in a palace, a man who has never known true hardship, and you are now living like a soldier. The food is bland, the weather is cruel, and the constant fear of defeat is a gnawing, soul-crushing presence. You are a king, but you are also a man, and the man inside you is beginning to crumble. The war is not going well. Your army, a force of cavalry and noblemen, is no match for the new model army, the professional, disciplined force of the Parliament. The Parliament's army is led by a man named Oliver Cromwell, a charismatic, brilliant, and utterly ruthless Puritan. He is a man who believes in the righteousness of his cause, a man who believes he is fighting for God himself, and a man who believes he is fighting for God is a very dangerous man indeed. You are a man who believes in the ancient traditions of war, in the honor of a charge, in the glory of a single, decisive battle. But Cromwell is a man who believes in a new kind of war, a war of ruthless efficiency, of crushing, overwhelming force. He is a man who is not afraid to kill, to burn, to destroy, to do whatever it takes to win. The old world of chivalry and honor is dying, and the new world of brutal, total war is being born. And you, the king, are a man who is a prisoner of the past, a man who is fighting a war he has already lost. A little known but telling detail of this war is the sheer number of civilians who were caught in the crossfire. The country was divided, and neighbors fought against neighbors, brothers against brothers, fathers against sons. The war was not just a conflict of armies, it was a conflict of families, of communities, of a nation that was tearing itself apart from the inside. Historians still debate the true reasons for your defeat. Was it a military defeat? A man who was simply outmaneuvered by a more brilliant general? Or was it a political defeat? A man who had already lost the support of his people. A man who was fighting a war that was a foregone conclusion. The truth is that it was both. You were a man who was a prisoner of your own ideas. A man who was fighting for a world that no longer existed. And in that conflict, in that brutal, bloody war, you were a man who was destined to lose. The war is over. Your army is defeated. You are a man who has lost everything: your kingdom, your family, your dignity. You are a prisoner, a man who is no longer the king, but a man who is now a traitor. And you are about to face the most humiliating and most terrifying moment of your life, a trial. Not by a court of your peers, but by a court of your enemies. A court that is determined to prove that a king is just a man, and that a man can be brought down. The war is over. Your army is shattered, your supporters scattered, and you, the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, are a prisoner. But you are not just a prisoner, you are a symbol. You are a man who is now a living embodiment of the struggle between old and new, between the divine right of kings and the rising power of Parliament. Your enemies, The men you once dismissed as rabble-rousers and upstarts are now the masters of England, and they are determined to prove a point that will shatter the very foundations of monarchy for a generation. You are put on trial for treason. The very idea of it is a radical, almost blasphemous act. How can a king commit treason against his own people? You are a man who believes that you are a vessel of God's will, a man who believes that you are the law, not a man who is subject to it. And so, you refuse to acknowledge the court. You stand before your accusers, a silent, defiant figure, a man who is a king even in chains. You are a man who is an old world fighting a new one, a man who is a symbol of a past that is refusing to die. The trial is a theatrical and brutal spectacle. Your accusers, men like Cromwell, men who believe in the righteousness of their cause, parade witnesses who testify to your tyrannical acts, to your lies, to your abuse of power. They accuse you of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. You, a man who has spent his entire life believing in his own divinity, are now being called a criminal, a murderer, a traitor to the very people you were supposed to rule. The humiliation is profound. The shame is a deep, soul-crushing wound. But even in the midst of this humiliation, you have a moment of defiance. You give a speech, a final, beautiful, and deeply moving speech in which you defend your actions, your beliefs, and your right to rule. You speak not as a criminal, but as a king, a man who believes that he is being sacrificed on the altar of a new, dangerous, and chaotic world. It is a speech that will echo through the ages. A final, desperate plea for a world that is already gone. A little known but telling fact of this trial is that the parliament that put you on trial was itself a fragment of a larger body. Many of the members had fled or were purged by the army. A fact that you, in your defiance, pointed out. You argued that this was not a court of the people, but a court of your enemies, a court that had no legal right to judge you. And in this, you were, in a very real and a very tragic sense. Correct. Historians still debate the legality of your trial. Was it a legitimate act of a people who were tired of their king's tyranny? Or was it a political sham? A show trial orchestrated by a powerful and ruthless army? The truth is that it was both. It was a brutal act of a people who were tired of war and of a king who would not compromise. But it was also a radical, unprecedented act. An act that would change the course of monarchy forever. The trial of Charles III was not just a trial of a man, it was a trial of an idea. A trial of a world that was dying. And a trial of a new world that was being born. The verdict is a foregone conclusion. You are found guilty. The sentence is death. You, the man who was born a king, are about to die as a criminal. You will be beheaded. A public execution in front of your own palace. A final, brutal message to the world that a king is just a man, and that no man is above the law. Your misery, a slow, simmering pot of political and personal tragedy, is about to boil over, and it will cost you your life. Your execution is a spectacle, a theatrical and brutal end to a life that was lived on a stage of your own making. But your story doesn't end with your death. It enters a new, even more brutal phase of the Stuart struggle. You have two sons, Charles and James, and they are now living in exile, a life of poverty, of humiliation, and of desperate hope. Your enemies, the Parliament and the new model army, have won the war, and they have established a new government, a commonwealth, a republic with Oliver Cromwell as its Lord Protector. But their victory is a fragile one, a victory that is built on the sands of an unstable political and religious landscape. Your son, Charles, is now a king without a kingdom, a man who has to live on the charity of foreign powers, a man who has to beg for money, for soldiers, for support. He is a man who has been stripped of his dignity, a man who is a constant reminder of the failure of his father. He is a man who has learned a single, brutal lesson from your death that a king who believes in his own divine right will be a king who loses his head. He is a man who will be a pragmatist, a man who will be a survivor, a man who will be a very different kind of Stuart from you. The interregnum, the period of time between your death and the restoration of your son, is a period of chaos and instability. Cromwell, a brilliant general, is a terrible politician. He is a man who is a Puritan, a man who believes in a strict, austere form of religion, a man who is seen by many in England as a dictator, a tyrant who is just as bad as the king he overthrew. He rules with an iron fist, he dissolves parliament, and he establishes a military dictatorship, a government that is more oppressive, more brutal, and more unpopular than anything you could have ever imagined. A little known but telling detail of this period is that Cromwell, in an act of political opportunism, offered to make your son, Charles, his heir, a deal that would have restored the monarchy with a Cromwellian successor. Your son, a man who was desperate to get his kingdom back, refused. He was a man who believed, with a religious conviction, that his right to the throne came from his blood, not from the approval of a revolutionary. It was a moment of principle in a life that would be defined by pragmatism. Historians still debate the true legacy of the interregnum. Was it a period of brutal dictatorship, a black mark on the history of England, or was it a period of radical, progressive change, a time when England was, for a brief time, a republic? The truth is that it was both. It was a period of brutal political repression, of a military dictatorship that was deeply unpopular, but it was also a period of immense social and religious change, a time when England, for the first time, experimented with a government without a king, the death of Cromwell. In 1658 is a moment of both relief and uncertainty for England. The Commonwealth, a government that was built on the charisma and the military might of a single man, begins to crumble. The country, tired of war, tired of austerity, tired of a government that was a constant source of friction, begins to look to the past, to the old ways, to the old idea of a king, and your son, Charles, the man who has spent his entire life in exile, begins to see a light at the end of the tunnel, a light that will lead him back to the throne. The long, brutal, and tragic struggle of the Stuarts is not over. It has simply entered a new, even more brutal phase. Your son, Charles, is about to return to England, but he is not returning as a king who believes in the divine right of kings. He is returning as a king who has learned a brutal lesson from his father's death, that a king who wants to keep his head must learn to compromise. The restoration of the monarchy is coming, but it will be a monarchy that is forever changed by the blood of Charles. The long, miserable winter of the interregnum is finally over. The English people, tired of the rigid Puritan morality of Cromwell's Commonwealth and the endless political instability, are ready for a change, and that change is you. Charles II, the son of the man they beheaded. You are not a man who believes in the divine right of kings in the same way your father did. You are a man who has spent your entire life in exile, a man who has learned the brutal lesson that a king who wants to keep his head must learn to compromise. You are a king who is a pragmatist, a man who is a survivor, and a man who is now about to return to a country that is desperate for you to be a king, but is also terrified of you becoming a tyrant. Your return to London is a spectacle of joy and relief. The streets are filled with cheering crowds. The church bells ring out in celebration. And the country, for the first time in over a decade, feels a sense of hope. You are a charismatic, charming, and witty man, a perfect contrast to the dour, humorless Cromwell. You are a man who loves women, who loves parties, who loves art, and who loves a good time. You are a king who promises to bring back the good old days, the days before the war, the days before the beheading of your father. But the joy of your return is a fragile thing. A thin veneer of celebration over a foundation of deep-seated political and religious divisions. You are a king who has been restored to the throne. But you are not a king who has been restored to absolute power. The parliament that fought your father is still there. A powerful and vocal group of men who are determined to make sure that a king never again rules without their consent. The memory of your father's tyranny and the memory of the brutal, bloody war that followed is a constant, unspoken presence in every room you enter. You, a man who is deeply Catholic in your private life. A man who has been living in Catholic countries for most of your life, are now the head of the fiercely Protestant Church of England. This is a profound and difficult contradiction. A contradiction that will define your reign. You are a man who has to play a part. A man who has to pretend to be something he is not. You are a king who is a survivor, but you are also a man who is a prisoner of his own circumstances. A little known but telling fact of your reign is that you, in an act of political necessity, had to have the body of Oliver Cromwell, the man who overthrew and executed your father, exhumed and symbolically hanged. It was a brutal and macabre act. A final, public message to the world that the long, dark shadow of the interregnum was finally over. But it was also a sign of your own political pragmatism. A man who was willing to desecrate the dead to secure the loyalty of the living. Historians still debate the true nature of your reign. Were you a good king? A man who was a brilliant politician and a brilliant survivor? Or were you a bad king? A man who was lazy, corrupt, and more interested in his mistresses and his parties than in the well-being of his country? The truth is likely that you were both. You were a man who was a brilliant politician, a man who was able to navigate the treacherous political waters of a country that was still deeply divided. But you were also a man who was a libertine, a man who was a symbol of a new, more permissive age, an age that was a reaction to the rigid austerity of Cromwell's rule. Your death in 1685 is a moment of deep political uncertainty. You, a man who was a survivor, have no legitimate children. The throne passes to your brother, James, a man who is a deeply devout and openly Catholic man. The memory of your father's tyranny is still there, a constant, unspoken presence. The fear of a Catholic king, a king who might try to restore Catholicism to England, is a terrifying prospect for a country that is still deeply Protestant. And your brother, a man who is a man of principle and a man of faith, is about to make a series of fatal mistakes that will lead to the final, and most brutal, chapter of the Stuart struggle. The reign of Charles II, that long, permissive, and ultimately pragmatic reign, is over. The country, which had a brief and joyous respite from the brutal religious and political wars of the past, is now holding its breath. The new king is you, James II, and you are a man with a deep and unwavering faith in Catholicism. The whispers, the fears, the long, bloody memories of a Catholic past, all of it, is now a very real and a very present danger. You are a man of principle, a man of faith, a man who believes in the righteousness of his own convictions, and you are about to collide with a country that is deeply, profoundly, and unshakably Protestant. Your reign begins with a sense of cautious hope. You are a man who has a reputation as an excellent naval commander, a man who is a professional soldier, and a man who is a pragmatist. But your pragmatism, it turns out, is a thin veneer over a core of deeply held religious beliefs. You are a man who believes that his first duty is to his God, and his second is to his people, and in a country that is deeply hostile to your religion. Those two duties are in direct and a very brutal conflict. You begin your reign with a series of political and religious blunders. You appoint Catholics to positions of power. You try to suspend the laws that prevent Catholics from holding office, and you try to use your royal authority to promote Catholicism in the army and in the government. This is not a man who is trying to find a compromise. This is a man who is trying to force his will on a country that is simply not willing to accept it. The fear of a Catholic conspiracy, of a plot to restore Catholicism to England, is a very real and a very present danger. The public is terrified. They remember the reign of Queen Mary I, or the Bloody Mary who burned Protestants at the stake. They remember the long, bloody, and brutal wars of religion that have plagued the country for generations. And they see in you a man who is a king and a Catholic, a very real threat to their religion, their freedom, and their lives. A little known but telling fact of your reign is that the most influential of your advisors, your brother Charles II, told you on his deathbed to never go on your travels again. A veiled warning to not do anything that would alienate your Protestant subjects and force you into another exile. You, a man who had spent your entire life in exile, ignored this warning. You were a man who was so convinced of the righteousness of his own cause, so blinded by his own faith, that you were completely incapable of seeing the danger that you were in. Historians still debate the true nature of your reign. Were you a Catholic tyrant? A man who was trying to subvert the laws and the religion of the country? Or were you a man who was a prisoner of his own faith? A man who was simply trying to do what he thought was right? A man who was a victim of a country that was too bigoted and too afraid to accept him? The truth is that it was likely both. You were a man who was a tyrant, but you were a tyrant who believed he was doing the right thing. You were a man who was a king, but you were a king who was a prisoner of his own conscience. Your reign, that brief and tumultuous reign, comes to a sudden and a very abrupt end. Your enemies, the Protestant nobles and the leaders of Parliament, reach out to your daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, the leader of the Dutch Republic. They ask them to come to England to overthrow you and to restore Protestantism to the throne. This isn't a civil war, it's an invasion. And you, a man who is a professional soldier, a man who has commanded armies, are now faced with a brutal choice to fight for your throne, or to flee. And you, a man who has no army, no allies, and no hope, choose to flee. You are a man who is the King of England, and you have just abandoned your kingdom. The long, miserable, and brutal struggle of the House of Stuart is coming to its final, ignominious end. You, James II, the last male Stuart monarch to rule Great Britain, are a man who has lost everything. You have lost your throne. You have lost your kingdom. You have lost the support of your people. You have been abandoned by your own daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, a man who is now a king, and a man who is now the final nail in the coffin of your dynasty. You are not a man who has been overthrown in a bloody, brutal war. You are a man who has been replaced, quietly and with a sense of inevitability, by a foreign power. This isn't a revolution, it's the Glorious Revolution, an event that is celebrated by the English people as a bloodless, peaceful transfer of power. But for you, the man who is on the wrong side of that revolution, it is a personal and a profound humiliation. You are a man who is a king, and you have been replaced by a man who is a prince, a man who is your son-in-law. It is a final, cruel, and a very fitting end to a dynasty that was born in violence and is now dying in shame. You flee to France, a man who is once again in exile, a man who is once again living on the charity of a foreign power. You are not a king anymore. You are a ghost, a relic of a past that the English people are desperate to forget. You spend the rest of your life in exile, a man who is a constant reminder of the fear of a Catholic king, a man who is a constant reminder of the long, brutal, and tragic struggle of the Stuarts. You are a man who is a symbol of a lost cause, a man who is a king in name only, a man who is waiting for a death that will bring a final, and a very brutal end to a dynasty that has been plagued by a constant, brutal struggle for power. A little known but telling fact of this period is that your son, the man who would have been James III, was raised in a court that was a constant, living monument to your lost cause. He was taught to believe in the divine right of kings. He was taught to believe that he was the rightful king of England, and he was taught to believe that he would one day return to his throne. It was a cruel and a very sad education. A man who was taught to hope for a future that would never come. A man who was taught to fight for a cause that was already lost. Historians still debate the true nature of the Glorious Revolution. Was it a bloodless, peaceful transfer of power? A triumph of parliamentary democracy? Or was it a foreign invasion? A coup d'etat that was orchestrated by a powerful and ruthless foreign prince? The truth is that it was both. It was a bloodless revolution in England, but it was a bloody, brutal war in Ireland and in Scotland. A war that was fought between the supporters of the Stuarts and the supporters of William of Orange. The Glorious Revolution was not a peaceful end to the Stuart struggle. It was just a new, and a very brutal, chapter in a long, bloody, and tragic history, the House of Stuart, a dynasty that was born in violence and has lived a life of constant, brutal struggle, is finally over, the last of your line. A man who is a king in name only will die in a foreign country. A man who is a final, and a very sad, symbol of a lost cause. The long, miserable, and brutal struggle of the Stuarts is finally over. And the English people, a people who are tired of war, of tyranny, of religious strife, can finally, for the first time in over a century, truly rest. And you, the man who is a king and a symbol, can finally rest as well. Now, as the long, dark shadow of the House of Stuart recedes, and the sound of the marching legions fades into the distance, you can finally truly rest. The cold stone of your palace has been replaced by the soft warmth of your blankets, and the crushing weight of your crown is gone. The constant hum of political intrigue, the fear of war, the shame of exile, all of it has finally fallen silent. The dreams of power, of betrayal, of the long, miserable struggle for a throne, they are just dreams now. They are a story you have told, a story you have heard, a story that is no longer your own. The night is quiet, and the world is still. The Stuart struggle is over, and you are finally at peace.